Energy Week with David Blackman and Ryan Ray. Episode 1. David, it's a pleasure to be here doing this with you. How's it going today?
Oh, just great, man. It's another beautiful day in Texas.
It is a beautiful day in Texas, but it's not a beautiful day for the rig count, as it fell by 15 last week, according to Baker Hughes. What was your takeaway from that?
Yeah, that's actually kind of significant. I've been actually kind of downplaying this rig count that's been going on really over the last month and a half, as just kind of part of the status quo and not a big deal. It was kind of going up and down until the last 3 weeks, and now we've had 3 straight weeks of falls in the rig count. It was down 7 last week, and I think since mid-August it's down over 40 rigs nationally, so it's down around 913 I think in the Baker Hughes count, and it had gotten up to close to 960. And so, in July, I was thinking we were going to, kind of stay static through the rest of the year because these big companies were putting in place their drilling budgets for the second half of the year. And at the time they did that, the price was pretty low, so they were putting in pretty conservative drilling budgets. And it seemed like it was going that way. But I think what's happened and what we're seeing with companies is their investors are putting a lot of pressure on management at these corporations now. To not focus as much on increasing production and increasing, their reserves in favor of increasing profits and return to the investors. And so you're seeing some of these companies, some of these bigger independent producers and even the majors who are in these shale plays kind of scaling back on their drilling programs now a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit, and implementing share buyback programs. There's several pretty big independent producers. Anadarko is one. Lynn Energy I saw is doing it. I think Noble was another one, who are now beginning to buy back shares to try to diminish the numbers outstanding shares and increase shareholder value instead of focusing so much on increasing production. Now, what that's likely to lead to, I think, is actually because the shale plays, the shale wells, have such a steep decline curve, I think in a few months what you're going to see is, now production in some of these shale plays is beginning to start to fall, and that's going to probably, in turn, lead management at these shale producers and probably pressure from investors to management at shale producers who are going to look and say, you know what, your production's going down. Now we want you to refocus on increasing production again. So it's just part of this unfortunate, in my view, but necessary cycle of management at these companies having to pay attention to what's going on Wall Street and getting pressured by their investors and always being in a reaction mode to that pressure. And so I think that's probably what this decrease in the rig count is. I mean, it's even impacting the Permian Basin now. So when it starts impacting the Permian, where people are, being very profitable at these prices, there's outside pressure playing a role here.
Yeah, you mentioned Wall Street putting pressure on them. It seems like, Pioneer took the biggest beating so far this year when their stock dropped, $30 or whatever it was in July because their oil to gas ratio switched. And you are seeing the headlines that are saying that, hey, Wall Street is wanting the CEOs, as you mentioned, to kind of think how they're doing their business strategy. But as we know, that Wall Street and oil and gas can both be greedy. And so it's one of these things where Wall Street has helped entice this environment that we're in, and now they're kind of saying, roll it back. But if you look at some of the debt that's coming up with some of these companies, it's going to be a hard transition for them to make, to go from how they used to operate to how they need to operate, especially when you got the short-term wells longevity like you mentioned.
Yeah, no, and it is. And it's a for the management teams at these companies, it's just a very difficult balancing act. There's been such a pressure, such a focus during the downturn on these companies and pressure to generate cash flow, right? Because you needed to generate cash flow in order to meet your debt obligations, if nothing else. And we had that big round of bankruptcies in 2016, some more in 2017, though not nearly as many. And that was just because these companies were having a hard time at those prices generating enough cash flow to meet debt obligations. Well, now most of these companies are past that point, and the investors are now saying, okay, look, your debt load's way down. You don't have to just just ramp up production constantly to generate cash flow. Now we want some of that money coming back to us in terms of return on our major investments that we've made in your companies. But like I say, I just really think in a few months when some of these companies start to see their overall production start to fall, the investors in those companies are going to say, well, what in the world's going on? Your production's falling. We can't have that. Get out there and drill some more wells. So, which is just, again, it's just part of the way the business works. And it's just a tough thing. It's why these people, at the executive level at these companies, why they make the big bucks, because these are the decisions they have to constantly make.
Yeah, and that kind of ties into where we're going next. Is if you see you talk about the position they're in now. If the price does spike to something crazy like $80 or $90 a barrel, it would be interesting to see how they would react, because then everyone is going to want to capitalize. Which takes us to our next article, which comes from oilprice.com. Rig count plunge set to boost oil and gas prices. Now, there's a lot of talk about the price. Just about every day, it seems like someone's got an opinion on the price, where it's going to be at this year, next year, 5 years, 10 years. You can always find an opinion on that. What were some of your takeaways from this particular article?
Yeah, and that's a piece by Julianne Geiger. She's really good writer over there at oilprice.com. And her whole thesis is, well, okay, so now the global market, is going to see U.S. shale rig count beginning to fall, and it's fallen, like I said, 5% here in the last 6 weeks. So that's fairly significant, and that's going to send a price signal to the market. It's just going to be another. Of course, there's 100 different factors every day that impact the price of oil on the global market, but it is going to be a bullish signal to the market. And when you combine that, with other bullish signals like OPEC actually compliance with their export reductions agreements is actually continuing to be very strong, and it looks like they're going to renew that thing through 2018 now. And also working on a deal with the Russians to make sure they stay in it, and the other non-OPEC countries that are in it. You just have these growing number of bullish price signals that are causing a very slow but pretty steady rise in the oil price here over the last couple of weeks, up above 50. West Texas Intermediate was at 52 early on Monday. Brent was at 58. Pushing 60, which is where OPEC, what their target was in this export limitation agreement that they've been in for the last year now, or almost a year. And so, it's actually just having the effect that OPEC wanted it to have. It's taken longer than they wanted it to, than they hoped it would, but we are getting that oil price up there. Now, what you have to hope is that differential between Brent and West Texas Intermediate begins to close as the rig count in the U.S. falls. Whether that's going to happen or not, I don't know. But it is a pretty daggum significant discount. $6 a barrel in this environment's a lot. But anyway, so I think Julianne's probably right about that. I think it does send a bullish signal to the market and is going to continue to influence that price upwards over the next few months.
Yeah, and I think for me, just kind of looking back over the last 15, 20 years, a good signal is that if you go back to 2015, first, second quarter, the oil shot up to like $60 a barrel, and they went out there and drilled it down. And we've been recovering, as you know, since late 2014 from falling prices and hitting bottom, coming back up. Well, right now we're not seeing them go back and drill it back down. The OPEC, as you mentioned, that's worked out well. And on top of that, global threat of war no longer impacts the price like it used to. We're in a really good, stable market, and it's nice and easy ticking up. And I just hope that from the U.S. producer standpoint, we kind of sit back and appreciate what we have here, because sometimes we see in the past where just a slight bit of opportunity, they've gone out and capitalized on it and then ultimately hurt themselves and others in the industry. And so hopefully as we go into 2018, like you said, there's all these good indicators, but for me, the biggest indicator that's encouraging is that it's just not surging up. It's a nice, slow, steady improvement, and then when it kind of gets up, it'll kind of recorrect and drop $1 or $2 here. And it seems like the past, 3 weeks, it's been flirting with that 50 line. It wasn't really sure if the 50 line, but I think now we're kind of feeling that the 50 line is going to be a good number that we can probably stay above most towards the end of the year.
Yeah, and I think we will. And it's like you said, the volatility has just been taken away from the market at this point. We don't have a lot of outages on oil production globally. There was some fear 2-3 weeks ago, I guess 3 weeks ago now, when the Kurds took that independence vote, and there was fear that Turkey was going to come in and shut down production in that northwestern part of Iraq where the Kurdish territory is. That didn't happen. But, that little premium, which seemed like it was about $0.50, has stayed in the oil price. It got built into it. It stayed there. And, when you just think about what we went through in the second half of 2014 with the dramatic drop, and then 2015, it was just up and down, up and down, up and down, constant volatility in the market. It settled down slightly in 2016, although it was still pretty volatile. But, man, this second half of 2017 has been the least volatile time for the oil price that I can remember, quite honestly, since the 90s. I mean, this whole century, it's been very, a time of very high volatility in oil prices. So these last few months have been, and it's really exactly what I expected. I wrote a piece right at the mid-June this year about the fact that all these big independent producers who are really drilling 80% of the wells that get drilled in shale plays in this country, had developed their second half of the year budgets during April, mostly April into early May, when the price had dropped down to the low 40s. And that was their outlook at that time, that they were developing this second half budget. And so they were very, very conservative budgets. And inside these corporations, and that's where I worked my whole career, is inside independent producers, except for 1 year at Shell. Inside those companies, once you get those budgets in place, unless you have a major disruption in the market, a big jump in the price or a big dramatic fall in the price, they're going to execute those budgets for the last 6 months of the year. And so when I saw that happening, it did appear to me, and I wrote this in Forbes, that probably it's going to be very low volatility. The price is going to, ramp up. I didn't think it would go much above 50, West Texas Intermediate, and, 52 is a pretty good bit above 50 at this point. But it just felt like we were going to be going into this time of pretty stable price, stable rig count. And I do just think it's going to kind of continue like this through the end of the year. But then, if OPEC renews that agreement, and this price is sitting at $52, $53, when these companies now, they're all in the middle of their process for setting their budgets for the first half of next year, and we're in a pretty strong price environment, and everybody thinks the price is going to continue to kind of keep rising a little bit, you're going to see more robust drilling budgets for the first half of next year. And I do worry a little bit that, when that happens, we get into the first half of next year, we could drill ourselves back down to a lower price again like we did this year. But anyway, that's all speculation.
Well, to your credit, though, I remember that article, and we'll link to that in the show notes, which you can find at globalenergymedia.com, your article in Forbes back a few months ago. But to your credit, I talked to you back then, and you were saying that you thought the rig count was going to stay between 950 and 1,000 rigs. And so I know we're talking right now that the rig count kind of dropped 5%, but this is kind of the range that you foresaw. Now, you obviously the fluctuation, you weren't saying every week from 950 to 1,000, but you were kind of thinking we'd be sitting in here, and so far, as we come towards the end of October, we're right where you kind of thought we would be.
Yeah, it's all worked out, and that's just, there's nothing magic about it. It's just kind of understanding how these companies, their internal budget processes work, and they're all kind of similar in that respect. So anyway, it's a good time. I just think it's a good time. I like getting up in the morning and kind of knowing what the price of oil is going to be.
Right. Well, let's transition now. We talked a little bit about the Middle East in that last conversation, but let's talk about OPEC. Next article, OPEC seeks help from U.S. shale. And to me, there is so many articles that you see. I'm not seeing them as much every day now, but there was a period where 6 to 7 months you would see headlines, OPEC versus Permian and OPEC versus this and this versus that. And I was just like, I don't think we all realize that these entities, the Permian, which isn't an entity, it's just a geographical area, and OPEC, which is, that's not the same thing, and how they look at each other is not the same thing. This article, the headline, I kind of caught the attention here.
Yeah.
Like, what's going on with this?
Well, this is a piece, again, it's at oilprice.com too. It's written by Robert Rapier, who's a colleague of mine, also a contributor at Forbes. Really good writer, and, he was just, the whole piece is just kind of chuckling about a statement that the Secretary General of OPEC made last week, urging shale producers in the United States to get together and limit their own production. And I had even written a piece about this back in June when he said something similar, and it just betrays a complete lack of understanding by OPEC, these ministers and the Secretary General at OPEC, of how the U.S. industry works and of U.S. antitrust laws. Not only is there no chance that shale producers in the United States, most of which are corporations, we have to remember, most of them are corporations, there's literally no chance that those competing corporations who compete with each other for positions in these shale plays, acreage, compete with one another for pipeline contracts and processing contracts and refining contracts and now exporting contracts with shippers. There's literally no chance, even if they could legally, that they would get together and agree to limit their own production. That's not going to happen. As we talked about earlier, they're so responsive to their own investors that that's really their main driving factor. But second of all, it's illegal for them to do so under the antitrust laws. I mean, they can't even, not only can they not do something like this, they can't even sit in a meeting and talk about doing something like this, literally. Really and truly, it would be illegal for them to even have the conversation. And so, when you see, and it's really, I mean, we laugh about it, but it's really kind of distressing to me to see someone who is the Secretary General of OPEC, the head honcho of this gigantic cartel that controls about 30% of the oil on the market today, to say something like this, because it just shows you that he literally has no understanding of this part of the industry, the part of the global market that also controls a big chunk of the global market. So it's kind of funny, but then in reality, it's really not funny. But anyway, shale producers are not going to artificially limit their production. That's not what they're in the business to do.
Yeah, and also it kind of shows that OPEC is sometimes blind to their own mistakes, because when you look at the cuts, how they impact some of the countries, OPEC doing something is not always good for every OPEC nation. Yeah. And they'll mandate, hey, everyone has to do this, and sometimes they'll give us slack here, slack there, but we've seen, Nigeria took a beating in their economy during some of these OPEC cuts, and so for them to come out and say, hey, U.S. shale producers, you need to do that, it kind of shows that even if they they completely miss, like you say, all of the legal aspects, they don't realize that just that business model, we have different people with different needs that have different, as you talked about earlier, different cash flow requirements and all these things, and just to kind of ignore that just shows that their business model completely just is ambivalent almost to how the market economy, as we like to say it, should work.
Yeah, and of course, so two things on that. First of all, you can understand why, because these countries all have national oil companies. I think all OPEC member nations are pretty much driven by national oil companies. They have a nationalized industry. And so their industry is completely different than in the United States. They have, most of these countries have one person who, at a whim, as we saw in 2014 with Saudi Arabia, can say, hey, guess what? We're going to flood the market with oil to try to drive shale producers out of business, right? Which in and of itself, that action in and of itself by Saudi Arabia, to the great detriment of countries like Nigeria, like Libya, like Venezuela, which is literally falling completely apart because of all this, that action just showed you how little, even Saudi Arabia, which is extremely sophisticated, how little their people understand the U.S. business and how resilient and strong the industry is here in the United States, and how diverse these companies are, just in terms of their financial condition, their need to borrow money, their cash flows. They don't understand any of that. They didn't. When Saudi Arabia did this, their whole strategy was, we're going to depress the price for a few years, put all these shale producers out of business, make them all go bankrupt, and then we'll artificially limit our own production, drive the price back up, and we'll all be rich, and we'll have bigger market share. Well, no, that was never going to happen. It's the product itself, the prize here in the United States. These shale reserves are just too valuable in and of themselves. The intrinsic value of those shale reserves means they're going to be produced by someone. And if one producer goes bankrupt and goes completely out of business, those assets are going to go to another producer and ultimately be produced. But the other part of it is, I think these actors in other countries think, well, if a company goes bankrupt, it means they're out of business, and of course that also isn't true. We have seen dozens of companies just over the last year and a half go into bankruptcy, come back out of bankruptcy, stronger companies in a much better financial position they were in before. And so all of this, again, it's kind of funny, but it really isn't funny, because it's why we're in the situation we're in today. And frankly, it's a big reason why the nation of Venezuela, there are people starving there, who don't have enough food to eat because of a stupid decision, a bad strategy implemented by Saudi Arabia 3 years ago. And these are the kind of unintended consequences that come about.
Well, one of the things that strikes me when you see this kind of stuff is it's not like we don't have Google, or they don't have Google, or they don't have access to U.S. University systems. You've traveled international. I've traveled internationally. Everyone knows someone who's come to school here and there. So why do you think they miss it so bad? Because it's not like they don't have access to this information where they can go read. Just on a surface level, I mean, I don't understand everything about national oil companies, but I know generally what some of the differences are and how they're ran, enough to know that it doesn't work like it does here in the U.S. Why do you think they just completely miss that? Because Aramco is not a small place. I mean, there's like 55,000 people.
Gigantic,
OPEC's, got multiple. They have what I'm saying is they have more resources than me and you to do this kind of research. So why do you think they miss it like that?
I think it just has to be cultural, because it's and I don't really understand it. What in the cultures, because I mean, when you look at the OPEC countries, obviously they all have their own separate and distinct cultures, but none of them appear to really understand the nature of the U.S. business. It's like you said, so many of the people running Saudi Aramco and these other national oil companies were educated here in the United States. I went to school with members of the Saudi royal family at the University of Texas when I was in college. I mean, and they're educated at Ivy League schools. They get advanced degrees. So you would expect there would be a greater understanding than there apparently is. And I don't know how else to explain it. It just has to be kind of the same kind of thing that you see with. Frankly, I write a lot about this too. Politicians in Washington who live in a bubble, and members of the media who cover them, they live in this bubble in Washington, D.C., where everybody thinks alike and everybody has the same opinions and everybody, has this culture that they all live in, and they have no idea what actually is going on out in the other 99% of the country. And I think it's kind of it must be similar with these national oil companies in these other countries, that they're so insulated in their own bubbles inside their countries and companies that they just lack an understanding of what really is going on in the United States. I just can't even think of any other possible explanation for it.
Well, what's going to be interesting, I know the Aramco IPO, that's still kind of up in the air on what they're going to do with that, but if it does come to the U.S. stock, one of the U.S. stock exchanges, they're going to get exposed to it pretty quickly by U.S. investors who will be putting a lot of pressure on them. So that would be an interesting moment if they go forward with their IPO and it comes out and all the Wall Street folks are now involved in talking about it, and they're going to have to these quarterly calls, how that will happen. We'll see how much of this is smoke and mirrors for them just going acting like they didn't know, to how much of them, because obviously if you're going through the IPO process now, you have to be familiar with some level of what you're going to be exposed to. So, when you hear stuff like this, you don't want to call someone a liar, but you also want to go, man, it would seem that you would have a better idea of how these things work. And look, even if you didn't know 2 years ago, now you should have learned, hey, what we thought wasn't going to happen didn't happen. Let's go research. Why did we miss this so badly? Right. And then you could be able to go, okay, well, okay, now we know. But it doesn't seem that they've learned their lesson there. Let's transition now back here to the States. This is, I know, something that's very passionate to your heart, something that you and I did. I think you said before we were offline that you love, actually. Is that right? Arctic refuge drilling closer as U.S. Senate moves to open site. I know you're excited about this, David.
Yeah, I'm excited in a very negative way. Look, I don't, as a personal bias, think necessarily that we're going to destroy the ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. by opening up a tiny sliver of it to all exploration. Okay, I mean, I think it's very safe ways to explore for it, and the polar bears can be protected, and the caribou can be protected. In fact, you know, the environmental community said we were going to kill all the caribou when we opened up the Trans-Alaska Pipeline 40 years ago, and now there are at least 6 times as many caribou up there now as there were when the pipeline opened. So, you know, it's not necessarily that, although I do, you know, I am concerned about the environment. But my whole deal on ANWR is this, okay? The oil and gas industry has been trying to open up ANWR since Jimmy Carter was president in the late 1970s. And, of course, Jimmy Carter killed it, and Congress killed it in 1978. Ronald Reagan got elected, and the first thing the oil and gas industry did was come back and start advocating for Ronald Reagan to open up ANWR. He tried to do it, and Congress killed it. And then George H.W. Bush got elected in 1989. The first thing the oil and gas industry did was go to George H.W. Bush and say, gosh, can you open up ANWR? And he tried, and Congress killed it. And then George W. Bush got elected, same thing. Now Donald Trump got elected, same thing, okay? And in every one of those instances, over a span of 40 years, what this has done for the oil and gas industry was give it an incredible black eye in terms of public perception for a prize that may be substantial and may not. I mean, the best estimate is there's somewhere between 8 and 16 billion barrels of oil underneath the northern 1/6, I guess, of ANWR is where you would be looking for it. And there's a very limited number of companies who would have any interest at all in going up there and trying to explore for it. It would take you decades to really get to the point where you could probably drill the wells because of all the lawsuits and other strategies that the environmental community will pursue to block you. And in the meantime, during all that time, as all this is going on, the national news media is going to be portraying you as people who want to kill all the polar bears. It's just a terrible thing, and the oil industry never has any effective answer for it in terms of public relations or a strategy, a real communication strategy around it. And it just, okay, so let's say there's the most optimistic estimate, there's 16 billion barrels of oil up there. Guess what? We've got more than that in one of 11 shale plays in the Permian Basin alone, according to the Energy Information Administration. We have at least 5 times that much oil, in the Permian Basin overall. We have at least 3 times that much crude oil in place in the Eagle Ford Shale by itself. Probably 4 times that much in the Bakken Shale by itself. Okay? And you know, guess what? We're not giving our industry a national black eye exploring for oil in the Permian Basin, the Eagle Ford Shale, and the Bakken Shale. So why are we doing this? Why do we take this on every time a Republican president gets elected? It boggles my mind. We never win, and we always end up losing in terms of public perception. It's just, to me, it's the dumbest thing we do as an oil and gas industry.
Well, I want to talk about the logistics of what that would look like, but before we do that, we've talked before, if you get outside of oil and gas, these are the types of stories that people outside of oil and gas focus on.
Yeah.
They don't think about, you know, the folks that are working actually on the ground. We talked about before, people doing recovery, the companies, the money that they're donating for that stuff. None of that gets paid attention to. These are the types of stories that, like you said, the national media is going to focus on. So if you're not in oil and gas, you're going to hear this, and you're going to hear they're trying to kill the caribou, the polar bear, or whatever it may be. I'm kind of curious. A minute ago, we were talking about the people in D.C. and kind of how they're in a bubble. Is this something maybe just the lobby groups that are, you know, that are talking to oil and gas companies saying, "Hey, look, this is where we need to go"? Is it an old oil mentality? What do you think is really kind of behind this idea?
Yeah, we get in our own bubble in the oil and gas industry. You know, I mean, everybody does. Okay, everybody in any industry does. You know, you get into these industry meetings and you say, "Oh man, well, there's no good reason why we shouldn't be drilling in ANWR, right?" And you can do it safely, and you can protect the wildlife, and you can protect the tundra and all this stuff. And yeah, everybody nods their head and says, "Yeah, you're right. And gosh, now we have a Republican president. This ought to be a big part of his plan. But at the end of the day, nobody else outside of the oil and gas industry necessarily agrees with any of that. I mean, literally with any single point of that whole conversation outside of the industry. What people hear is they hear a story for 30 seconds on the CBS Evening News that shows the polar bears floating around on a piece of ice in the Beaufort Sea up there off the north slope of Alaska. And the lead into the story is oil and gas industry wants to drill in critical polar bear habitat. That's all people hear, and they're thinking, golly, why do you want to go mess with these poor nice polar bears? They're not hurting you. Why do you want to go hurt them? And that's really the limit to what anyone outside of our industry hears about it and thinks about it. You know, they're going to see these reports and just automatically have a negative reaction to us, and there literally is nothing we as an industry can do to counteract that. I mean, literally, unless we wanted to spend hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on public relations, and this industry has never been interested in spending millions, much less hundreds of millions of dollars on public relations, so it's not going to happen.
Okay, so I'll get to the logistics of it. If you look at what happened with Mexico and their energy reform, people praised it, and I think it is a good thing. But practically, before they're really drilling a lot of wells, as you mentioned, it takes a lot of time, and they're not facing the environmental. It's just building the infrastructure to get out to where they can drill wells and all the problems. You need to get gas, you get people, all that stuff out there. So just logistically, let's just say the environmental groups, they said, okay, you know what, you can drill. No problem on that end. How long would it take before we had a good gathering, pipeline infrastructure out there, roads? Is this something that we could even do if Trump green-lighted it and banned all the environmentalists tomorrow? Or are we still 3, 4, 5 years away before we have real production up there?
Well, you're probably, you're not 20 years away, but you're probably 5 years away. I mean, the one good thing that does facilitate it is you do have Prudhoe Bay, which is only, I think, a little more than 100 miles away from where the target area is. So it wouldn't take that much time to put in the infrastructure. What's going to take all the time is it's probably going to take you 5 years to do a full environmental impact study, right, under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. That's the first thing any company interested in drilling up there is going to have to do. I'm pretty sure there was one done many years ago, but the federal government is not going to let you go in there under a 20-year-old or whatever it is, environmental impact statement. So you're going to have to do a full environmental impact study, first of all. That's going to take years. It's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And then once you publish that environmental impact study, the Sierra Club and the World Wildlife Federation and 100 other environmental non-development groups are going to come out and sue you. First, they're going to appeal through the appeals process, the administrative process, but then when they lose there, they're going to take you into the federal courts. And where are you going to have to get through? You're going to have to get through the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the most liberal anti-oil and gas court of appeals in the United States. And so that's going to take years. I mean, it's going to take you years and years and hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe billions of dollars probably, before you can even think about laying a pipeline from ANWR over to Prudhoe Bay, and then, bringing in your first drilling rig to drill your first well. Well, there's only a handful of companies in our industry who can afford to make that kind of an upfront investment, first of all. And second of all, those few companies, I'm sure not all of them have any interest whatsoever in going up to ANWR for 8 billion barrels of oil when they can drill in the Permian Basin where there's 80 billion barrels of oil. So it just, again, God bless any company who wants to take it on, fine. But you're giving the industry, the whole industry, a black eye, and it's probably ultimately going to fail, but just for 100 different reasons.
All right, speaking of suing and settling and EPA and all that good stuff, you had a piece come out recently on Forbes talking about just dealing with these environmental groups in the courts and how the EPA has historically dealt with it and how they're changing it now. Now, this doesn't change what we're talking about with ANWR, but it will change how we see the federal government deal with some of these lawsuits that have been thrown at them over the past, 10, 20 years. Yeah,
it's been about 25 years that Sue and Settle has been a thing, as the young people say these days. So the Sue and Settle, I call it a racket. I think it's very similar to kind of influence racket that you see on The Sopranos. It's a deal where environmental groups come in and they attempt to force an agency to either change a regulation or list an endangered species or take some action that is not necessarily popular or going to be able to win through the normal administrative process. My best example, my favorite example, is the Endangered Species Act with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You had two environmental groups, anti-development groups, who had made a habit of trying to list the most plentiful species they could find and do 100 of them at a time under the rubric of, well, they're going to have diminishing habitat if you allow oil drilling out in a certain area. And the Wild Earth Guardians was the most notorious of the two, and they had forced Fish and Wildlife. What they do is they come up with about 100 different proposed listings at the same time, and the agency only has 90 days to respond when it gets a nominated species. So they'll nominate 100 of them. The agency can't respond in 90 days, and when the agency fails to respond, then the anti-development group sues the agency in federal court, and the agency says, okay, well, let's just negotiate a settlement, and we'll do this if you'll settle with us. And so a settlement, the court ends up issuing a consent decree, is what they call it, and orders the federal government, by the way, to reimburse the anti-development group for its legal fees for suing the agency. Over the years, EPA has paid out more than $50 million in legal fees under this Sue and Settle Racket. Fish and Wildlife, over $30 million. And so what happened last week was Scott Pruitt, who runs the EPA now, announced that the EPA will no longer be entering into these kinds of settlements. It will no longer coordinate efforts with these anti-development groups to basically regulate through the court system. And, that's always been a horror show to me, because this is not the way regulatory policy should be set in this country. There's a very structured order to the regulatory process that was completely done away with during the Obama administration, that this administration is trying to bring us back into the normal order, the kind of structured process that's envisioned under the laws. And, having regulations done through the courts just blurs the distinction between the judicial and the executive branch of government. So I think Pruitt's move is really good. It's really good for our society. I expect Interior Secretary Zinke is going to make a similar announcement soon, and the whole thing at Fish and Wildlife under the Endangered Species Act is going to be done away with as well, and that's just a good thing for the country, because it takes us back to the rule of law and the way things ought to be happening in terms of making regulations in this country.
Well, one of the things that's frustrating about this is I don't know what the EPA or any of those the Wildlife Fish's budget is, but you're talking about spending that kind of money on paying attorney fees and just settling off. It's just a waste. And if you're saying that these are necessary agencies, which is a different discussion altogether, but if you're saying that, if we all agree, okay, these are necessary agencies, and you're suing them just to make money off of them, you're preventing them from doing their job, because they're having to spend so much of their budget to pay off these these law firms and these settlements. And so if you're saying that, hey, look, I'm concerned about the environment, well, quit making them waste their money on frivolous lawsuits. But then I'm sure when you challenge this, that you probably got a little kickback saying that, no, you're probably too big, pro-big oil and stuff like that. We've lost the ability to look at this stuff. I mean, I can't imagine you going, okay, I'm really concerned about the environment, so therefore I'm going to make a racket out of taking money from the people who are supposed to protect the environment. It seems almost counterintuitive.
Yeah, and of course, these anti-development groups, their whole agenda, the Wild Earth Guardians, they're very upfront about it. Their whole agenda is to stop human progress under using the Endangered Species Act, which, is a great tool if that's what your goal is, and you have an agency that's willing to coordinate efforts with you in entering into these consent decrees. We had the dune sagebrush lizard as the greatest example in Texas here, that was listed as a threatened species, not an endangered species, but a threatened species, which is a little less severe, 5 or 6 years ago now here in Texas. And this lizard is everywhere in the Permian Basin. There's millions and millions of these lizards. It's not an endangered species in terms of it's about to become extinct, which is what the Endangered Species Act is designed to prevent. It is a quote endangered species under this rubric that, well, if you go out and drill an oil well, you have to disturb earth. And by the way, these lizards live in disturbed earth. So what happens is when you get a bulldozer out there to start leveling the ground so you can put down a pad to set your drilling rig on, the lizards move in on your operation because now you have all this disturbed dirt there, and here comes all these dune sagebrush lizards. And so that was why the Wild Earth Guardians said, oh, gosh, we got to try to get that species listed because it's everywhere in the Permian Basin. Literally, the whole Permian Basin is its habitat. And so that listing impacted not just the oil and gas industry, but the highway system, any road you want to build, any shopping mall you want to build, any other kind of a house, anything, any structure you want to build, the first thing you have to do is get out there and level the ground, right, and disturb the earth. And so, it's a brilliant strategy. When you really think about it and you take a step back, you have to admire the creativity of thought in some of these groups for even thinking of this whole racket in the first place. So it's been very effective for him. I hope Mr. Pruitt and Mr. Zinke can eliminate it permanently. We'll just have to wait and see what the courts have to say about it.
Well, I think this is one of the things you talked about, the headlines earlier. The headline that comes out is, Trump government opposes environmental, safety measures or something like that. And when you really sit down with most practical people and you kind of break down what you just did, you would see, okay, well, that's probably a little bit of an overreach there. And on top of that, what you do, and you kind of touched on it lightly here, is it's not just Exxon out in the Permian who has a big legal staff and a staff to deal with all the regulations. It's small independent producers who are having to deal with this. And when the federal government makes regulations, they usually don't think about the little guy and the work that he has to do. It's usually geared towards an Exxon type staff. And so it really hampers a lot of people in a lot of different ways who don't have the staff to deal with this, and then it hurts the economy. And so the trickle-down effect, if you will, of this can be far-reaching than maybe people who are trying to be genuinely environmentally friendly, maybe not this group, but just people who are hearing about this stuff. They don't realize that the groups that they align themselves with are actually probably doing more damage to the cause that they're after and to people that actually know.
Right, and it also does damage to the reputation of the laws themselves. I'm a big fan, to be honest with you, of the Endangered Species Act. I think the Endangered Species Act was a very noble law when it was put into place, when Richard Nixon, by the way, signed it into law. And it was designed because you have to remember, in the late 60s, early 70s, we had all these major, highly recognizable species like the grizzly bear and the polar bear and the bald eagle and the gray wolf and the whooping crane. All these animals that everyone knew what they were and recognized and wanted to save, right? There was a general public consensus. Hey, you know what? We need not to let the bald eagle go extinct. And so they passed this law. They put it into effect with an original intent of saving these big, recognizable species, and it was very successful in doing so. All those species I just rattled off are still in existence, and most of them are not even listed as endangered anymore. In fact, I think of the species I just rattled off, only the whooping crane is still listed as an endangered species, and that's just because it reproduces so slowly. But there's 100 times more of them now than there was then. But the point being that sometime in the late 70s, the snail darter came about. And that was the first court case in which the courts ruled that, well, this whole theory of diminishing habitat is a valid theory to take under the Endangered Species Act, even though that language really was not part of the original intent of the act. And since that time, it has been incredibly expanded and just completely taken away from the original intent of the law. And then you have this whole illegitimate racket that sprang up around it that really just kind of diminishes the respect people have for a law like that, and that's a shame.
Yeah, it's a shame that it's really hard to have these conversations because some people say if you even say what you said, well, you're against it. No, you're just trying to take a good balanced approach, and so hopefully as we go along, energy professionals can realize that we have a lot of similar interests here, especially when it comes to the environment. We really want a lot of the same things. Just how do we get there? Well, David, enjoyed the first episode with you. I know we got one article we didn't get to. We will link to that.
Maybe we do that next time.
Maybe do it next time or link to it in the show notes for the listeners. And DB Daily Update. Anything else you want to plug before we get out of here today?
Yeah, DB Daily Update is just my own personal website where everything I write and all these podcasts, various podcasts or radio appearances I make, I link to them there, so you can find everything I do at that site, and appreciate anybody visiting it.
Okay. Well, David, enjoyed it, and look forward to doing it again next week.
Absolutely. Thank you.